This is Module 4 in the seminar about Rosslyn Chapel and Initiatic Freemasonry. Here we're going to revisit the history and development of speculative Freemasonry, which has its origins in England and in London of the 1600s, the 17th century. Here's a kind of overview of the origins of what we call modern Freemasonry, not as a craft guild, but as a what has been in many cases a men's club of esoteric spiritual education. We have initially what we call operative masonry and the building trades that exist in England and other places. We have an alliance of the Knights Templar and the operative Masons before the Inquisition from the 12th to the 14th century. And then after the Inquisition and after the Templars were persecuted and driven out of France, we have an alliance that continued, and obviously continued, in Scotland and England and Portugal. The evidence of Rosslyn Chapel and Scottish Templar grave sites, many other things, shows us that the alliance between the building trades and the Templar nobles became even stronger afterwards. During the time of the Hermetic Renaissance, and in order to understand more about this and study it more deeply, you should take our seminar entitled The Western Mystery Tradition. But in the 16th century, with the founding of the Fratres Lucas and the translating of the Corpus Hermeticum and so on, in the time of the Hermetic Renaissance in the 16th century, the Templars themselves and the Templar families and the noble Templar families were very interested in this more esoteric form of spirituality that ran quite counter to the interests that were ruling the Catholic Church. And this became part of the Western mystery tradition, the underground tradition of Kabbalah and so on, that resulted in the development of Rosicrucianism and other clandestine schools. There were political ideals that arose with the Rosicrucians in the beginning of the 17th century. And this involved ideas of democracy, democratic government, ideals of an ideal state and a perfect state, and ideals that were based on Hermetic ideas of as above, so below, and the beginning of what we today call science. These things were all opposed and considered to be satanic by the Catholic Church and by the beginning of the 17th century and the early 1600s with the rise of Puritanism, also by the Puritans. And so both the Catholics and the Puritans were down on Rosicrucians and people who had these esoteric philosophies. Now, keep in mind, there is no Freemasonry yet. Now, before Freemasonry comes into existence, there's a very important and influential person, Sir Francis Bacon. He is responsible for the voyages of exploration and the founding of the Jamestown colony. He was in control of the King's purse, King James. He oversaw the translation of the King James Bible. He even did some of the translating himself. He was a very important and influential person. Now, many people claim that Elias Ashmole was the actual founder of speculative Masonry or Freemasonry, and he was obviously a very important person in the beginning of this. But Sir Francis Bacon and his ideas were very clearly incorporated into the beginnings of speculative Freemasonry. The whole fraternity and all the ideas were taken from Lord Bacon's New Atlantis. I'm quoting from Peter Dawkins, who is head of the Francis Bacon Research Trust. In his New Atlantis, Bacon, who is called Solomon, calls his temple the House of Solomon, or College of the 6 Days' Work, i.e. of creation, founded by Solomona, that's Solomon, and comprised of a society of philosopher priests whose badge is a red cross, that's the Templar cross, and who maintained a secrecy or invisibility from the world at large. Robert Boyle, writing in the middle of the 17th century, referred to the college as the Invisible College, or the Philosophical College. Well, this was actually the beginning of the development of scientific societies. It was through these impulses and these urges, and then later on the cooperation of people who were had bonded together as speculative Freemasons, that the English scientific societies were begun, and the experiments with electricity and all the other things that people like Benjamin Franklin and so on were participating in were sponsored and were studied, along with alchemy and the other precursors of science. So Bacon is a very important person to learn about and to study. We talk about him more extensively in the seminar in the Western Mystery Tradition about his connection with the Shakespearean writings and so on. Bacon took the rap for King James when the Puritans got so strong they were actually able to cause the court to be put on trial, so to speak. And so King James, who was a person who was rather free with the monarchy's money, and had spent a lot of it, and had also indulged in some kinds of activities that would be considered by Puritans to be too lax and morally impure. Francis Bacon literally took the rap for all of that and was condemned, and he drops out of history as a person who leaves the court in a great deal of disgrace. In fact, all English school children are taught that Francis Bacon was an embezzler and so on. He was not. It's very interesting that the Francis Bacon Research Trust and other groups have begun to recover the great richness that Francis Bacon left us, and the one thing he did is protected the monarchy for at least another generation against the incursions of Puritanism, until finally the Puritans were bold enough to actually behead the king and take over for 20 years until the British people got so sick of them they kicked him out and they went back to the monarchy. But Bacon was what we might call an esoteric martyr. And in the last century, we discovered some of the effects of Francis Bacon. For example, a book of all the language we're used to seeing in Shakespeare. Remember, Shakespeare was supposed to be a great inventor of language and terms. And all these words are kept in a notebook in the estate of Sir Francis Bacon. Many people are convinced that Bacon was actually the main author behind a lot of the Shakespearean works. And there's a great deal to this that we'll talk about sometime in another program. In any case, the time of Francis Bacon, the beginning of the 1600s, the beginning of the 17th century, was a time when Puritanism was growing very strong, and the English established colonies in America. Now, all these impulses, these scientific impulses that had begun with Bacon's description of what science was, because remember, it is Bacon who describes what science is and the mission of science is, and the process of inductive logic and so on, and he is credited with that in textbooks. But after this point, this interest in this kind of knowledge, which was considered to be satanic knowledge by Puritans and by Catholics, it was what was kept in these underground traditions, and eventually grew into the Royal Society of London for the promotion of natural knowledge, which was the first scientific organization, and that gave a very, very strong impulse to the development of what today we call science. Now, here's the title page of a Latin translation of Bacon's Advancement of Learning, which was published in 1624. Note that in Bacon's name, right below his name, you have his name as a Masonic mark. You see this sort of little M in the middle and so on. That is a Masonic mark that is applied to Bacon. Bacon obviously had connections with the building trades and with their shorthand, etc. One of the things that Bacon was a great cryptologist. He developed all kinds of codes that were used both by the government and by himself for esoteric works, and people have still been working on cracking these codes in order to find some things that Bacon may have left for posterity. There have been a lot of interesting searches for things based on the ciphers that Bacon left behind. But here we have his Masonic mark. Before Freemasonry as we know it today had even been established. Now, the first non-operative Mason, the first speculative Freemason, was Elias Ashmole. And Ashmole was a Hermetic philosopher and an alchemist. He was the author of the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum and the Institution, Laws and Ceremonies of the Most Noble Order of the Garter and so on, and the founder of the Ashmolean Collection, the British Museum. He's still very much revered in British history as a great scientist and as a great nobleman, although he wasn't as noble as they get in England. And he was initiated into an operative lodge of masons, of stonemasons, and he was called a non-operative or a speculative Freemason. So what was that all about? What did that mean, and why did that happen? Here's a photograph, or not a photograph, but is a drawing of a painting of Ashmole. He was a student of John Dee, who had been patronized by Queen Elizabeth and was a great researcher into science and also the occult and spiritualism, and many of the works that he did are still being investigated by people. He was an ardent apologist for the Rosicrucians. He was a person who strongly defended the ideals of Rosicrucianism even when they were under attack by both the Catholics and the Protestants. He was initiated in Warrington in Cheshire in on October 16th of 1646. So mid-17th century he was initiated as a speculative Freemason, and by 1690 4 speculative lodges existed in London and 1 in York. Membership of the people included a strong interest in Hermetic sciences and alchemy. So the foundational impulses for bringing together people into these lodges as speculative Freemasons was basically esoteric. It had to do with Hermetic sciences and the development of what we today call modern sciences. Now, we need to talk a little bit about the origin of Rosicrucianism. There's a legend that says Christian Rosenkreutz traveled far and wide and was initiated into many things and became a great master, a wizard, a person who was a master of healing and alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone and so on. And he returned to his little place in Germany and trained some of the other brothers of a monastery. There were many noble and middle-class Templar family connections with alchemy and the Hermetic sciences, and that spread through these Templar families privately to other families. There was a need for public meetings during the Catholic Puritan persecution period, and when Cromwell, in the middle of the 1600s, the middle of the 17th century, when Cromwell had taken the government by violence and was now acting as the President of England, and people were going around at Christmas time. The extreme Puritans believed that Christmas was a pagan holiday. They wanted it stopped. So down the streets of London on Christmas Eve would go criers from the government saying, "No Christmas, no Christmas." People were forbidden to celebrate Christmas, etc. As you can see, this wasn't going to fly very long, very well. But it was a pretty pretty radical kind of revolution. It was not as bloody and not as radical as the French Revolution, but nevertheless very radical. And during this, there was legal persecution of anybody who was connected with things that were considered to be heretical, things that were considered to be impure. And that would include all the connections with alchemy and the Hermetic sciences. And so meetings were forbidden between people who wanted to gather on the basis of these things to talk together and speculate and form societies about them. There was a need for this kind of meeting among the nobles who were interested in these things, but they were being suppressed by the government. And so the Masonic guilds, the stonemasons, could meet legally in pubs and other public places. Cromwell allowed these guilds to meet this way. Well, there was a precedent for the idea of speculative masons in Scotland, and we go all the way back to Rosslyn Chapel, where the builder, the founding noble, was also a Grand Master of the building lodge, or the building guild. In fact, he was called a master of the building guild. He was not only the protector, he was the chief officer of it. So we might say he was the first speculative Freemason, at least that we know of, but there had been a precedent because aristocrats were Grand Masters of Scottish Masonic operative lodges in the past. And, of course, the alliances, the Templars and the aristocratic patrons, protectors of the Masonic guilds, were owed favors. And so the solution was that the English aristocrats and their associates could be inducted as non-operative Masons in the English lodges, and that's what happened. By coming into these lodges and becoming members of the lodges, but they didn't work with stones or do anything like that, they were allowed to meet publicly, and they could therefore go ahead and network and bring their meetings together. So this is what the work of the operative Mason was. It was building things, hauling things, putting things together. Now, the Puritans were, back in the time of King James, the beginning of the 1600s, who succeeded Elizabeth, the Puritans were very strongly opposed to the government of King James. They were, of course, very anti-Catholic as well. I've told you that there is much evidence that points to the idea that the person who did a lot of the writing of several of the really important Shakespeare plays was Francis Bacon, who was known, by the way, to Ben Jonson and all the great poets of his age as Midas, because he could take any poetry and immediately transform it into something beautiful. And Bacon grew up writing plays and masques and presenting them to his families and things like that. So he was known as a playwright from the very beginning. In about 1620, there appeared an anonymous document called the Rosicrucian Manifesto. And in it were outlined the basic principles of Rosicrucianism. They carried forward the principles of democracy along with those of science, and which at that time was both what we would call alchemical as well as chemical, and so on. There was a tremendous reaction, both Catholic and Puritan, against Rosicrucianism and its ideals. Puritans tried politically to work with a sympathetic prince to establish a state, a Rosicrucian state, and that attempt failed. Basically, the Hermetic sciences, alchemy, theurgy, and other kinds of things were what were used and studied by these people. The Christian Kabbalah, which was developed from the Jewish Kabbalah, and that combined with the failed Rosicrucian state, which was considered to be politically dangerous, led to persecution and the driving of all Rosicrucian influences underground. There's much to be said about this, but we do this in another seminar. So along comes Cromwell and his Puritans, and they walk off the king's head and take over the state of England in London. No Christmas, I told you about that. They were extreme Puritans. They believed that Christmas and Easter were actually pagan holidays that had been taken over, and they were quite correct. They, in fact, were. They were holidays that were taken over from the Egyptians much farther back than they even understood. The 25th of Khoiak was the celebration of the birth of Ian Horus, and children were given gifts, and the divine baby was born, and all this sort of thing. So yes, it is actually true, but that didn't mean it was bad or evil. And they had prohibitions then against public assembly, especially of people whose religion and philosophy were questionable. And so no Rosicrucian and other Hermetic heretics were allowed to assemble. Here is a representation of Cromwell, Sir Oliver Cromwell, standing upon the bodies of the enemies that he's defeated, and so on, making himself great and glorious. Here is a cartoon from the period called the Royal Oak of Britain being chopped down by Cromwell. And he says to kill, and go ahead and do these things. If you read all the things around this, there are many, many satirical comments from those. There were many people very opposed to what Cromwell was trying to do and the reforms he was trying to put through. And part of all this was his campaigns against the infernal forces, the devilish philosophies, and all this sort of thing. It was kind of an inquisition. So for that reason, it was quite necessary for people to, if they were going to continue what they were doing, to meet legally, and they did so by joining the lodges of operative Masons, who kind of sheltered them and hid them in these positions, and the lodges were kept secretly. The doors were shut. They were tiled. There was a tiler who was at the door who would not let anybody in. Nobody could hear what went on in the lodge meetings, etc. And as a result, operative Masonry was exposed to even more esoteric philosophy, and the speculative Freemasons developed a very powerful spiritual allegorical interpretation and moral interpretation of the tools and all the enterprises involved in operative Freemasonry. In the year 1717, which was at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 18th century, 4 of the London lodges formed a Grand Lodge. And then in the ensuing years there were several rival Grand Lodges, and then the rivalry between the Scottish lodges, who claimed to be the oldest and probably are, and different English lodges went on. There was the ancient Freemasonry, and there were those of all of England and south of the Trent and many different places. By 1775, we had developed the first degree that went past the 3 degrees of operative Freemasonry, which were that of the apprentice and the fellowcraft and the master. We had developed the Royal Arch, which was the first of the higher degrees that went beyond that. So now we're getting into the realm of higher speculative Freemasonic degrees. There was a building finally of a Freemasons' Hall. Now Cromwell was gone. There was nobody to stop them. An awful lot of the royalty and the people around the court were now connected with Freemasonry or very involved in the Hermetic sciences and so on. And so there was now money to contribute to this movement. It was growing very quickly. The American Revolutionary War was led by American and French Freemasons, because by this time Freemasonry had spread to France. And French Freemasonry and English Freemasonry contributed to the development of colonial Freemasonry. And of course the great Freemasons who founded this country, wrote its constitutions: George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and many, many, many others. In the 1800s, then, the turn of the 19th century, there were many initiates within the royal families, and at that time the Masonic lodges could be established in one of two ways. They could be established by a charter from a nobleman, or they could now be established through a complete unanimous vote of Master Masons in a certain gathering area to form themselves as a lodge if they had a minimum number of them. And these two means of developing Masonic lodges became kind of two approaches to Freemasonry. The ones that were democratic, that would then vote to establish themselves with the law, would also vote to determine who was going to be the Grand Master. And the Grand Master would be elected, and then he would serve a term, and another one would be elected. That was the democratic pattern upon which the American Constitution and things like this were written. But there was another form, that was the appointed form, where a charter was given to a certain person because he was considered to be a great adept, and that person would be Grand Master for life of a lodge that was chartered, and nobody would elect that person. That person would simply remain as the Grand Master of that lodge. And of course the weakness in that was very often the royalty would appoint idiots to be Grand Masters, and the people in the lodge didn't like that. And so people preferred the democratic method of electing their lodge masters. Now we have a lot of royal family initiates by the beginning of the 19th century. And finally we'd form in England a United Grand Lodge, the English United Grand Lodge. Well, from the 1700s to the 1900s we have the development of American Freemasonry, and they're based on the democratic ideal of election, an election of lodge masters, and so on. What happened finally in the 1900s, women were admitted as Masons in French Masonry, but women were excluded in English Masonry. In American Masonry it was kind of a question about whether women should be, how they should be related to, and eventually subsidiary orders were designed for them, like the Order of the Eastern Star and so on. But because of the concern that Masonic lodges in England had, and also in America, that women would be made into Masons, there was included into the oath that was taken by the Master Mason when he's raised a Mason what is called the Anti-Comasonic Clause. I will not make a woman a Mason. And so Freemasonry was not, which did not initially exclude women from joining, and there are histories of many women that were initiated earlier on, now became a totally male thing by the beginning of the 1900s. And the interesting thing is that in America, because America was founded and its ideals were, so many of them were drawn from Freemasonry. You see the Masonic symbols all over our dollar bills and all this sort of thing. You see Masonic symbols even engraved into the way the Capitol is laid out and so on. So all the Masonic lodges were very open. There would be a great big sign on a Masonic lodge. It would say, I'm a Masonic lodge. This is where the Masons meet. And Masons became very powerful in this country. In Europe, however, they had been suppressed, not just in England, but in Germany and France and all the other nations where they arose, and what would become Italy later and so on. And so their meeting places were never marked by signs that said that this is a Masonic lodge. In fact, they were totally clandestine. Even today, when you go to Europe to a Masonic lodge, there's no sign. You just say, that's the door. You knock on it, you have to give your proper handshake and other kind of credentials to get in, and then it's closed. So this is how Masonry developed. And the United States was the land of freedom, and it was also very much in the debt of the Masonic philosophy and the development of science and things like this. And so it was an open, not a clandestine thing, only in America, not anywhere else. If we look at the development of Scottish and French Freemasonry, we have English Freemasonry appearing in France in the 1600s. It begins with guards of the exiled Stuart royal family, who have been are no longer have power in England, and they are Catholic, and so they open lodges, and their people open lodges in France, where they're accepted. The lodges were chartered by royalty. That was the secular realm of nobility, just as chivalric orders were chartered by royalty, not by popes or anyone else. And the Scottish Mason always claimed to be the original Mason from the lodge called the Mother Kilwinning Lodge in Scotland. And that is a very serious claim. I would take that claim very seriously, and I think it's probably true. But the English will always claim that their lodges were the first ones to be founded. In 1728, there was an English Grand Lodge of France, and then there was established another Grand Lodge called the Grand Orient, and it was in competition with the Grand Lodge. And in 1877, the Grand Orient dropped the term Grand Architect of the Universe. It dropped the requirement that people believe in the Judeo-Christian God in order to accommodate Buddhist, Hindu, and other Masons, because Masonry was spreading all over the world in other countries that were not Jewish or Christian. And so in France, they dropped the requirement of the worship of God as the Grand Architect of the Universe, and that absolutely infuriated the English. The English Grand Lodge cut off all relations to this for this irregularity, which they saw as atheism, and that was really the end of fraternal relationships between the French and the English lodges. So remember, it was the French and the French Masons that helped George Washington defeat Cornwallis and all these other people. And so we have the Americans on very good terms with the French Masonic lodges, and after the War of 1812 and all these things were over, on very good terms with the British lodges, but the British are not on good terms with the French lodges. Now, late in the 19th century, in the French lodges developed what was called co-Masonry, or the obedience, or the type, or the brand of Freemasonry known as co-Masonry. This was Masonry that admitted women and men equally. And that was established by a lodge that unanimously voted, all the Master Masons unanimously voted to separate, create their own obedience, and accept women and bring them in. And that was the Co-Masonic Lodge. And that was established in France and came over to the United States. We had finally official women Masons. Of course, these were not recognized at all by the British. And in the 20th century, France also developed what was called the Grande Loge Mixte de France, the Mixed Lodge of France, which was also a male-female lodge. And that has not been ever formalized in the United States of America. There were some attempts to plant it over here. I was part of those attempts. And that resulted in the development of the Pansophic Lodges, which I am past Grand Master of. But basically, France has been the place where women's Masonry has really developed. Today, the Grand Orient in France consists of 6 major Masonic obediences, including the Grande Loge Mixte de France. American Freemasonry is quite a story. The founders of the country were all great, were masters and grand masters of Freemasonry, and they led lodges. Benjamin Franklin. George Washington, here is a picture of George Washington in his Masonic apron, was a master of a lodge. Because of the relations that the American Freemasons had with the French Masons, they were able to negotiate the kind of help they needed in their war against the British. But you have to realize that the American Masons came from the British Masons, not from the French. And so there were actually clandestine relations going on between American Masons, generals, and British as well. It was a rather confused situation. This is an apron showing Masonic imagery from the time of George Washington. It's very much like the symbolism you will find on the very old carpet at Kilwinning Lodge. This is the symbol that is used for Masonry. It's debated whether the G stands for God or whether it stands for geometry. The French would say it stands for geometry, and the British would say it stands for God. But in any case, the concept of speculative Freemasonry, which has nothing to do with actually building things out of stone, has to do with building yourself, building your soul. Each person is building his or her own soul as an unfinished temple of God. And all these symbols are brought into the different degrees of initiation in Freemasonry. First is the symbol of the Temple of Jerusalem with the two great pillars, Jachin and Boaz. And between these pillars, always people are initiated and advanced. So you will find on every Masonic floor these pillars, and they're designed a certain way, and you'll find an altar. And on the altar you will find in the originally the Christian lodges, you'll find a copy of the Bible. And both Old and New Testament were used with the Jewish Masons. But now you will find the Quran or Vedic literature or whatever else up there on the table, on the altar, when someone who is a Buddhist or a Hindu is initiated into Freemasonry. The idea is it's called the Book of the Law. It is the idea that there are laws of God, there are divine laws that run people's lives, and they are expressed differently in different religions and with different religious Bibles and so on. As you can see, this does not make fundamentalist Christians happy, because Masons are saying, well, our English Bible is one of many Bibles involving people in the world and so on. It's before this altar that people kneel to take their oath as apprentices and as fellowcraft, and then finally as Master Masons. The floor, you'll notice, is a checkerboard. The white and black checkerboard represents the fact that we live in a world that is both good and evil, that has positive and negative forces, and good, correct, and incorrect choices to make, moral choices to make in our life. The symbols taken from the craft that are interpreted, and I'm just going through a few of them, are such as these. There's the symbol of the rough ashlar and the smooth ashlar. The rough ashlar is the rough-cut rock that's quarried from the quarry, that must be, by the apprentice, must be smoothed into a perfect shape so it can fit into the temple of God and play its part and do its role in supporting things. And it has to be done carefully and beautifully. And this is associated with the development of character and the doing away with the flaws in the character and so on through attention to these things. We have the Mason square, and we have a tool for making circles. This compass is exhibited on top of the Holy Book, whatever book is used, and when a person is initiated as an apprentice, both the points of the compass are hidden underneath the square to symbolize the fact that he's just now beginning to come into Masonic light. When he's initiated into the middle category, he's advanced and initiated as a fellowcraft, then one of the points is exposed and the other one is hidden under the square. And when they're initiated as a full master, then both of the points are visible. And these quotations, this one from Ecclesiastes chapter 12, is the quotation that applies to each of these initiatic ceremonies in the Judeo-Christian tradition. These are the symbols of Pythagoras, the postulate of Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem. There's long lectures that are given on the moral meaning and the spiritual meaning of the Pythagorean postulate that says that the sum of the squares on the legs of a right triangle will always equal the square on the leg or the hypotenuse, the long leg. And there's a great deal that is drawn out of that through allegories and things that are given at initiation. This is a tool called a mortar. It's used for planting mortar to hold rocks down. And the mortar is compared to brotherly love. It's that which glues the lodge together and the people together. There's a tremendous requirement for loyalty to each other. The Freemasons established special charities for their own people, for their own widows, and there's much that goes on with this, and if you ever study Freemasonry, you'll learn a lot more about it, but this is a symbol of the brotherly love that binds people together. This is the sun. The sun represents the lodge master who is standing in the place of the great architect of the universe, who is shining Masonic light upon people, and much is made of the sun. The moon is another symbol that's used, and they're placed in certain places for rituals, and there are many allegorical descriptions of what they mean. The apron, which is a sheepskin or a lambskin, is worn when people are in session. Well, this is the apron that was used, of course, by the stonemason for protecting his clothes from the sharp stones and so on, but it's purely ritual and formalistic, but people still put on their aprons, and when they put on their aprons, the aprons will indicate what degree of Mason they are and so on, and they must be worn in a certain way. Different lodges have different symbols that are put on them. There are philosophical symbols. This is a skull, or a skull and crossbones. This represents death, the fact that Masons must be aware of the fact that they only have so much time in life. They have so much time in life to achieve and to contribute to their society, and to make use of that time wisely. There are lots and lots of symbols of this. The skull and crossbones was initially a symbol of the mortality of life, and it didn't become a pirate's flag until much later in human imagery. But the skull is a representation of the fact that we, in Masonic time, you spend 8 hours a day, you do your work, 8 hours at night you sleep, and the other 8 hours you work in study or in prayer or at home and in relaxation and so on. There's a whole time schedule here with Freemasonry. This is the symbol, the eye, the all-seeing single eye, very often appears in the Masonic symbol, and it represents the unity of the source of all being in the universe, sometimes called the grand architect of the universe, sometimes just called God. This is a hat that is worn by the master. This became conventional in England and in France. This was the dress of the bourgeoisie, not the high class and the upper class nobles, and not the peasant class, but the middle class. And this is the hat that was worn, and is still in many lodges worn by the lodge master. And it represents that in Freemasonry, all people are brothers. All people have equal footing, no matter what your wealth or your status or your royal pedigree is or anything else. Everybody are equal brothers. And so this is the hat of the bourgeoisie, which is worn by the master, representing that. This is a symbol that represents the death of a Mason, the broken column, the mourning of one who loves the Mason, and time with his scythe and so on standing behind her. The sprig of acacia that she holds is important and symbolic, and in Freemasonry there are special Masonic funerals and even graveyards that Masons go to if they so choose, and these are all symbols that are used in Masonic funeral practices, and they symbolize the hope of life after death. They symbolize the meaning of life and of a life well lived. You see that they're standing upon the third step of a raised stairway. This is, of course, the Masonic symbol, the square and the compass, and the G or the I, representing the Masonic philosophy that all beings and all things are under the guidance of a grand architect, or basically one must say that Freemasonry is philosophically monistic. They are philosophical monists who believe in the unity and the design of the universe. These are 3 candles that are put around the altar, and the 3 candles represent 3 lights of Masonry, and Masonry offers light. It offers an understanding about what life is and whence we come and whither we go and so on. And so the lights of Masonry are represented in this way. And when one is initiated, and the blindfold, or the that which obscures the vision of the person symbolized by the hoodwink is removed, then there is a sound. People clap their hands together and they see light. This is, of course, the initiatic dress that goes back to the ancient mysteries of Greece and so on. And in Freemasonry we have particular hand grips, tokens, words, ways of standing, and so on. This is a representation of a person being sworn in as an apprentice. He's the candidate. The person who leads him is the conductor. There's the altar and the lights, and here's the master wearing his hat. These are just images I've taken off the internet. This is not top secret stuff. These are not secrets you can't reveal in Freemasonry. There's nothing really secret about Freemasonry. It's been portrayed by its enemies, which are first and foremost the Catholic Church, and then the fundamentalist Christians, who go back in their opposition sort of spiritually all the way back to the opposition of the Inquisition and of the Puritans, been portrayed as a thing that is demonic. In fact, it's a mystery school that teaches people to live according to rules that are ethical, and to share universal brotherhood with all people, and to make their place in society, and in a way that contributes to the structure of society. It's a very strong moral education. The first 3 degrees of Masonry are called what is known as the Blue Lodge, and they're basically in ethics and ethical instruction. These are hailing signs that have certain meanings in Freemasonry. If we look at American Freemasonry, we have to recognize that the architects of the American Revolution, many of them were Freemasons, and the people who carried it out were Freemasons, the generals, and so on. The early colonial America was very much involved in Masonic and Freemasonic organization. And it was through that Masonry and Freemasonic ideals of election and voting and democratic rights and rule by constitution or republican ideals and so on contributed to the forming and the drafting of what became the standard American democratic institutions. And the earliest Masons were the role models for early America. They were the great men, the great people who became elected in high office and in their communities. But Masons got too much power. They got a great deal of power in America, and after the War of 1812, there was a movement against Masonry that was called the anti-Masonic movement. It was charged that some Masons had executed another Mason for violating his oath. Which in fact may have happened. There's a lot of abuse in Masonic lodges, and people are initiated almost in a way of being hazed and other kinds of things. There's a whole tradition of this, especially in the South, of these kinds of things. And there's a whole old boy system that goes along with it. And there was a lot of feeling against this, and the anti-Masonic movement really did cut a lot of the power of Freemasonry in the American Democratic Republic, so that by the 1820s, 1830s, coming into the Civil War, Masonry had not as much power, although a great deal of power. You will find, for example, if you go to the Grand Canyon, that all the great rocks and stones in the Grand Canyon were named by Masonic organizations. There are Masonic institutions from coast to coast in the continental United States, and Freemasonry didn't just leave a mark. It was, in fact, basic to what it meant to be in the American power structure, and in every community it was this way. We can also say that what happened eventually is other organizations, other fraternal organizations, and many of them men's and women's organizations, spun off of Freemasonry in the latter part of the 1900s, or rather the 1800s, the 19th century, and then you got eventually your Odd Fellows and Elks clubs and things like this, and then eventually these clubs were threatened with lawsuits for discriminating against women, and they had to open their doors to full membership by women. And now, as we speak at this time in the early part of the 21st century, there are women Grand Masters in some of these spin-offs from Masonry, like the Elks clubs and things like that, Rotary clubs. And it's very likely that Freemasonry will have to open its doors to women, not just as auxiliaries, women's auxiliaries, but full Masonic participation. But the anti-Masonic movement in the early part of the 19th century did cut some of the power that the Masons had in the formation and carrying on of the early years of the United States. Freemasonry was then revitalized by Pike and others in the mid part of the 19th century, and then there was some confusion about how it was going to proceed. You see, there were higher orders of Freemasonry, what was called the Scottish Rite and the York Rite. The York was the English Rite, the Scottish was the Scottish Rite. And these went on to advanced degrees, to a 32nd degree and so on. And this was in competition with Egyptian rites, which were the rites of Memphis and Mizraim. And through various kinds of, just because of what finally won out and what became used and popular in the United States, the Egyptian rites fell away. And now we still have the York and the Scottish Rite, although the Scottish Rite is probably the most popular. These are for people who have already been through the first initial Blue Lodge and become masters and so on. And then they go on through these higher degrees. These higher degrees symbolize the mystery schools of the Western mystery tradition, the Rosicrucians, the Templars, and many others. And unfortunately, the way these rites are carried out, people don't study and really learn what these mystery schools are about. They learn just a very quick, they just go through a sort of drama enacting something and learn a sort of quick thing about it, and then they're advanced into that degree and they can wear another piece of regalia and so on. But that's what happened in the latter part of the 19th century, is the development of the higher degrees. And at the same time with what we call the ultra-Masonic lodges, the lodges that did admit women and that operated in a deeper, more esoteric way. Now at this time, in the latter two-thirds of the 19th century, there was a strong Catholic attack upon Freemasonry because of French politics. The Bonapartists were trying to gain power again in the French democracy and turn it into basically a kind of a republic under a dictatorship of a descendant of a Bonaparte. And those who opposed it were, of course, the Democritists, of whom were the Freemasons and the Ultramasonic people and so on. And so all kinds of false things were spread and in newspapers and everything through attacks that were probably masterminded from the Vatican to claim that Masons were executed people, or that they ate babies or drank their blood or something like that. And what happened is one of the great adepts of the last century, one of the founders of the Gnostic Ecclesia, who is known, his initiatic name is Pappus, Gerard Encausse, succeeded with some other people in discrediting all these claims, and the Bonapartists lost, and that attempt to wipe out, to discredit Freemasonry was itself discredited. However, the very same charges were revived in the 20th century by Christian fundamentalists who went back and read all these old things and have now are on a very strong campaign as we speak in the early 21st century and the late 20th century to discredit Freemasonry as anti-Christian and as heretical and black magical and satanic and so on. So that has happened. The French Bonapartists lost as a result of this. The American fundamentalists are still trying to depict Freemasonry as a satanic organization, a secret organization. After World War II, there was a decline. The membership in Masonic organizations in America was, as it still is in places like France and Europe, it was very often white-collar people, educated people, university teachers, other people who were very educated, and they had a much more intellectual view and very often were interested in the esoteric aspects. But after World War II in the United States of America, Masonry became mostly blue-collar workers, and intellectuals were not so much associated with it. Part of it was probably because of the keeping of women out of things, or the relegation of women to these auxiliaries, and there may be other reasons for it. And now, in America, as we speak, Freemasonry is very much on the decline. The lodge rolls have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and they're mostly populated by old men. There are a few revivals, etc. But American Freemasonry, I believe, will not ever revive again until they make a radical change and admit women. Because, let's face it, women don't want their husbands going out at night a couple of nights a week doing things that they're not involved in, and the husbands themselves don't want to do that. We have a very different kind of relationship between the sexes now than we did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So will there be a revival in the 21st century? I have worked very hard myself to establish male-female Masonry here in the United States, and I've done so legitimately through the Mixed Lodge of France. This is called Pansophic male-female esoteric Masonry, and we're interested not only in male-female, but also in having equality of the sexes. We're also interested in the esoteric roots and esoteric studies of Freemasonry. Will there be a less esoteric, a more general kind of male-female Freemasonry that will come about? I don't know. We'll just have to watch and see what happens here in America. Well, we can make some conclusions then about how the initiatic traditions of antiquity were preserved or came into Freemasonry. It's clear that the French building guilds were loyal to the Knights Templar after the Inquisition, and probably both concealed and protected them from papal and French monarchic forces. Scottish Masonry received initiatic conventions of classical antiquity through association with the Knights Templar, who, as patrons of operative Masons, were often inducted as Grand Masters of the Guild. Now, this is in the 15th century, 2 centuries before the development of what we call Freemasonry. During the persecution of Rosicrucian and other esoteric activities by Cromwell in the mid-1700s, aristocratic descendants of Templar families and others interested in the forbidden Hermetic sciences and the precursors of science, like alchemy, were received into the protection of Masonic guilds so that they could publicly assemble. The roots of Masonic initiation are esoteric. They are not just white-bread bourgeoisie. And they date back to the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity through the impulse that was brought into this culture in the Renaissance by the Knights Templar. Modern Freemasonry retains abbreviated summaries of the European mystery schools, such as the Templar and the Rosicrucian, in its Blue Lodge initiation and systems of higher degrees, but has very little knowledge or understanding or appreciation or application or development of those traditions. I know that when I was in Bellingham, Washington, before I was even a Master Mason, I was asked by the master of the Scottish Rite Lodge if I would be willing to come over and explain to people what this was all about, because I was an expert in these things. These things are not known and understood by most Masons. They haven't got a clue what they're doing when they walk through these rites and these rituals. So, will this be revived or will it not? We don't know. But I want to say something about the significance of the initiatic mystery schools in human spiritual history. And it is part of what I think should be and could be the spiritual heritage of Freemasonry. The first and important thing that these mystery schools did is to take in hand the development of the individual soul. People were seen in the very early period, the second, third millennium before the Christian era, was a time when humanity became more than just part of a corporate or tribal group. It was kind of a transformation from corporate to individuated humanity. It's a very important transition that happens that's facilitated by the development of the mystery schools. The concept of apotheosis, or the transformation from mortal to immortal or human to divine, or the idea that one is in basic essence and nature divine but has fallen and needs to return to that divine state, or even the idea you find, for example, in Buddhism, that we all have the Buddha nature but that we have polluted it and we have to get back in tune with it, this sort of thing. These are important ideas that are kept alive by the mystery schools. The mystical school, the mystery schools and Freemasonry are based on ethics and morality. That's what I call an ethical, mystical form. Moral living, character development, and sacred, secret gnosis required for apotheosis are all put together. You don't become divine by being a jerk. You have to earn it, and you earn it by being responsible member of society and a responsible human being. This is done by learning and practicing ethical human behavior. And this has always been basic to the mystery cults. People were not even accepted unless they were seen by other initiates to be worthy of acceptance. The mystery schools also developed a spiritual aristocracy. Initiates already have or are expected to develop leadership and service in their society. Whether we're talking about the Greek mystery religions and schools, or Freemasonry, or even some of these, the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, or whatever it might be, these initiatic groups were set up to prepare people for ethical leadership in society, to contribute. And it was in Freemasonry that the transformation became more than just of the individual, but the transformation of society itself. And out of that came our basic ideas of democracy and democratic government. Membership in an initiatic mystery school was by invitation only. New initiands are recruited by initiates, or they might propose themselves to people they know to be initiates. The initiates are supposed to be saints living in a profane world. Ye are the salt of the earth. So the those who are initiated into the mysteries or baptized into the Christian mysteries or whatever they are supposed to be those who are part of what's going to save the world. As Eldridge Cleaver once said, you're either part of the solution or you are part of the problem. There's no middle ground here. Initiates are expected to be part of the solution. And one of the most important things was what we might call holy silence. You will find these kinds of admonitions given in all kinds of mystery religions, even in the early Christian mysteries. Jesus says, do not give holy things to the dog, do not give your pearls to the swine, lest they turn again and rend you. You're supposed to keep silent about things that people would not understand that are part of initiatic understanding. This is badly misunderstood as clandestine secrecy. But the issue with the initiatic mystery cults was not secrecy, but was silence, sige. Whether we are speaking of the holy sige of the Gnostics, the deep, profound silence of knowing, or the silence of the wise man who doesn't speak except when he has something to say that is important, to use the words well. This is a concept we find in the mystery cults and the mystery religions. Here's an image we find even from the time of the Egyptian mysteries. The image of the finger to the lips, keeping silence. Do not reveal the inner mysteries to others, because people must be prepared to understand these things. Wisdom is not achieved in a day, and you cannot speak wisdom to a fool, and you cannot speak calculus to a first grader. So this concept of the mystery schools in human spiritual history is that there is a spiritual aristocracy that knows. They do not consider themselves to be better than, but they do not try to evangelize and sell their ideas to people, but rather to help people grow into their ideas and grow into the higher ways of thinking and knowing. So what has been accomplished by Freemasonry, and what have their goals been historically? In the Blue Lodges, the spiritual progress and the moral and ethical progress of an individual in Masonic light. The Blue Lodges are your basic grade school and high school education in human morality and spirituality and striving. There are strong ethical teachings that are allegorized by the tools of the builder to develop moral character. The idea is that people are being trained for leadership in social transformation, the training of kind of a spiritual elite. Not that are superior to other people, but that are worthy to take over tasks of leadership because they've been through proper ethical and moral training. Not only that, they've developed the practices that bring these into actuality. So there are many things that have come out that are the fruits of this kind of discipline, and examples would be the U.S. government, and constitutions, and the philosophy of American democracy, constitutional republics, democratic republics. The French Republic was based on Masonic ideals. It was the Constitution was written by people who were members of Masonic lodges, just as we did in the United States. English democracy was developed when we developed a House of Commons as well as a House of Lords and so on. This was all under the influence of English Freemasonry. In the higher degrees, the higher rites and the ultramasonic degrees, the emphasis upon higher spiritual progress in divine light. This goes beyond the social goals of a Blue Lodge. This is not a religion because there are many different beliefs inside of Freemasonry. It's very universal, like Hinduism, but there are many metaphysical paths to empower religious goals for all religions. And so in the higher and ultramasonic degrees, for example, Scottish Rite and Memphis Mizraim and so on, there is an empowerment of the individual spiritual growth and development, whatever that might be and whatever religious orientation it might be in. This is the end of the seminar. I hope I've been able to show you that there are very important esoteric roots to Freemasonry, that the Masonic initiation does not come through the craft. It does not come through the history of the craft. It comes rather through the very potent contact of the craft lodges with the Templars and with influence even from the East, Hinduism and so on. And Templarism brought with it initiatic traditions that dated from antiquity, that they had learned and picked up in the Middle East. And all this is part of the legacy that Freemasonry holds, regardless of how consciously it may or may not hold it in the 21st century.